The cheap polyester of the server's uniform chafed Liam's skin, a constant, irritating reminder of how far he had fallen. Each clink of champagne flutes, each burst of self-important laughter felt like a grain of salt being ground into the open wound of his life. He stood near the wall, a tray of canapes held ramrod straight, trying to make himself invisible in a room designed for exhibition. This was the grand unveiling gala for the Blackwood Tower, the city's newest monument to glass and steel arrogance. It was a spear of polished obsidian piercing the skyline, a testament to the ego of its developer, Marcus Thorne, and, by extension, a testament to the triumph of Liam's ex-wife, Evelyn. He saw her across the ballroom, a vision in emerald silk, clinging to Marcus's arm. Her laughter was the loudest in the room, a sharp, metallic sound that had once been the soundtrack to his life and was now the anthem of his defeat. Beside her stood her mother, Beatrice, a woman whose face seemed permanently frozen in a state of regal disapproval, a look she had perfected over the 10 years she'd had to endure Liam as a son-in-law. A wave of nausea washed over him. Just 6 months ago, he had been a husband, a homeowner, a man with a quiet, respectable life. Now he was a ghost in his own city, serving appetizers to the very people who had orchestrated his demise. The divorce had been a brutal, systematic demolition. Evelyn and her family, armed with Marcus's team of predatory lawyers, had taken everything: the house, the savings, his dignity. They had left him with nothing but crushing debt and the hollowed-out shell of the man he used to be. His manager, a harried man named Dave, nudged him forward. "Circulate, Liam. Don't just stand there like a statue. The shrimp puffs are getting cold." Liam nodded mutely, his feet feeling like lead weights. He began his slow, humiliating march through the glittering crowd, offering food to people who wouldn't even meet his eyes. He navigated through clusters of men in tailored suits and women draped in jewels, their conversations a meaningless buzz about stock portfolios and summering in the Hamptons. He felt like an alien, a creature from a different, lesser world. Then his path converged with the one group he had been desperately trying to avoid. Evelyn saw him. Her perfectly painted lips curled into a smirk of pure, malicious delight. She tightened her grip on Marcus's arm, a theatrical gesture of possession. "Well, well," she said, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "Look what the cat dragged in." Marcus, a man whose charisma was as manufactured as his blindingly white teeth, chuckled. "Working hard, are we, Liam? It's good to see you're staying busy." He looked Liam up and down, his gaze lingering on the cheap uniform, the worn-out shoes. It was a look of utter contempt. Beatrice sniffed disdainfully. "I always said he lacked ambition. At least he's found his proper station in life." "Service?" The word was an insult, a final judgment on his worth as a human being. Liam's jaw clenched. He wanted to say something, to scream, to throw the tray of food at their smug faces, but he couldn't. He needed this job, this pittance, that barely kept a roof over his head in a tiny, rented room across town. So he said nothing, his silence, their victory. Evelyn, emboldened by his passivity, took a step closer. She reached for a canapé, her fingers brushing his. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she accidentally knocked a full glass of red wine from a passing tray. The liquid arced through the air and splashed directly onto the front of Liam's crisp white shirt, a violent crimson stain blooming across his chest. Gasps rippled through the nearby guests. The conversation stopped. All eyes were on him, the clumsy server who had ruined the moment. Evelyn feigned a shocked expression, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, my goodness! I'm so sorry!" she exclaimed, her voice ringing with false sincerity. "You must be exhausted. Here." She reached into Marcus's jacket, pulled out his wallet and extracted a crisp $100 bill. She didn't hand it to him. She crumpled it slightly and tossed it at his feet. It fluttered to the polished marble floor like a dead leaf. "For the dry cleaning," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And for your trouble." It was the ultimate humiliation, not an apology, but a transaction. A public declaration that he was nothing more than a problem her money could solve. The laughter that followed, led by Marcus and Beatrice, was like a physical blow. It shattered the last fragments of his composure. His eyes, burning with unshed tears of rage and shame, lifted from the stained shirt and the pathetic bill on the floor. He looked past their cruel, smiling faces toward the grand stage at the far end of the ballroom. A massive banner was draped behind it, bearing the name of their triumph in elegant gold script. Blackwood Tower. The name cut through the fog of his humiliation like a blade. Blackwood, it was his name, not his married name, which he had shed along with his old life, but his family name, the name of his grandfather and his great-grandfather before him. A name, he had always been told, was respectable but unremarkable, a name with roots in the city that had long since withered and died. He had always thought it was just a coincidence. A common name, perhaps, but seeing it there, emblazoned in gold, connected to this specific plot of land, sparked something deep within his memory. It was a story his grandfather used to tell him as a boy, a rambling tale about a clever ancestor, a prime piece of city land, and a promise that stretched across generations. He had always dismissed it as the romantic folklore of an old man, but now, standing there in his stained uniform, with their laughter echoing in his ears, a strange, cold certainty began to form in his gut. It was a desperate, impossible thought, a seed of a mystery. And in that moment of absolute degradation, it was the only thing he had left to hold on to. The days that followed the gala were a blur of shame and simmering anger. Every time Liam closed his eyes, he saw Evelyn's mocking smile and the $100 bill lying on the floor. He quit the catering job the next day. He couldn't bear the thought of ever facing those people again, of ever being that powerless. He'd rather starve. His life with Evelyn had been a slow, 10-year erosion of his soul. He had been a university archivist, a job he loved. It was quiet work, filled with the scent of old paper and forgotten histories. It didn't pay much, but it was meaningful to him. Evelyn, when they first met, had claimed to find his passion charming. She was a junior associate at a marketing firm then, full of dazzling ambition. He supported her completely, believing in her dreams even when she began to belittle his. As her career ascended, her affection for him curdled into contempt. His quiet life became a source of embarrassment for her. She called his work dusty and irrelevant. She mocked his modest salary and his lack of interest in corporate ladder climbing. "You're content being a nobody, Liam," she would sneer during their increasingly frequent fights. "But I'm destined for more than this." Her more arrived in the form of Marcus Thorne. He was everything Liam wasn't: loud, flashy, dripping with a kind of aggressive wealth that Evelyn found irresistible. The affair began subtly, with late nights at the office and hushed phone calls. Liam, trusting and naive, believed her excuses until the day he came home early and found Marcus's ridiculously expensive sports car in his driveway. The divorce was her masterpiece of cruelty. Marcus's lawyers painted Liam as an unsupportive, unambitious husband holding back his brilliant wife. They argued that her success was achieved in spite of him, not because of him. They twisted his financial contributions into insignificance and magnified hers. The judge, swayed by their polished presentation, agreed. Evelyn got the house they had built together, the art they had collected, the life they had shared. Liam got a court order for spousal support payments he couldn't possibly afford, and a mountain of legal fees. Evelyn and Marcus operated from a simple, brutal worldview. Wealth equaled worth. People were either assets or obstacles. Liam had been demoted from a disappointing asset to a forgotten obstacle. They truly believed their success was a sign of their inherent superiority. Their new tower wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of their philosophy, a monument to their victory in the savage game of life as they saw it. Their foundation wasn't built on brick and mortar, but on a fragile, fraudulent belief in their own divine right to have it all. But the name Blackwood Tower refused to leave him. It was an itch in his brain, a loose thread in the tapestry of his defeat. His grandfather's stories, once dismissed as fanciful, now replayed in his mind with urgent clarity. He had spoken of a great-grandfather, Elias Blackwood, a shrewd and private man who had bought up land when the city was still young. "He never sold the important parcels, Liam," his grandfather had said, his voice raspy with age. "He tied them up in knots so tight only a Blackwood could ever undo them." Driven by a sliver of hope, so thin it was almost transparent, Liam went to the one place he still felt at home, the city archives, with the plat maps for the downtown core, cross-referencing them with old property deeds. His fingers, stained with archival dust, flew across delicate yellow documents. For days he traced the history of the single city block where the tower now stood. He found the original purchase record from 1898. The buyer was indeed Elias Blackwood. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was real. The story was real. He kept digging, following a century-long paper trail. He saw the land being leased to a small manufacturing company in the 1920s. He saw that company get acquired in the 1950s, and the new conglomerate get absorbed by another in the 1980s. The original lease, with its specific terms and conditions, was passed from owner to owner like a forgotten heirloom, its significance buried under decades of corporate paperwork. Marcus Thorne's company had acquired the land rights from the last in that long chain, likely assuming, with the arrogance of modern commerce, that the underlying deed was a mere formality. While Liam was unearthing his family's past, Evelyn was busy cementing her glorious future. She called him once, her voice a sickening blend of fake concern and undisguised glee. "I just wanted to make sure you're doing okay, Liam," she said. "I heard you left your little catering job. You really should try to hold on to something. Marcus and I are just so busy, you know. There's an article coming out about us in Metropolis magazine. The power couple behind the new skyline. Can you imagine?" He could imagine it perfectly. Her words were meant to sting, to remind him of the chasm that now separated their lives. But they had the opposite effect. Her overconfidence, her absolute certainty of her own invincibility, fueled the fire in his belly. She and Marcus were so busy looking up at their own reflection in the sky, they had never once thought to look at the ground beneath their feet. Liam's research hit a wall. He had the lease history, but he couldn't find the master document, the trust his grandfather had spoken of. The public records only referenced it by a registration number. To see the document itself, he would need to find the law firm that had drafted it over a century ago. After a week of cross-referencing old city directories and legal registries, he found it. A small, old-fashioned firm with a name that had barely changed in 150 years. Alistair, Finch and Sons. He made an appointment. Walking into their oak-panelled office felt like stepping back in time. The air smelled of leather and polish. He was greeted by a man who must have been in his late 70s, with kind eyes and a neatly trimmed white beard. He introduced himself as Arthur Alastair, the grandson of the firm's founder. Liam sat across a vast mahogany desk, his hands trembling slightly as he explained his situation. He presented the deed, the lease records, and the trust number he had found. Mr. Alastair listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When Liam finished, the old lawyer simply nodded, stood up, and walked over to a massive floor-to-ceiling vault behind his desk. He spun the heavy combination lock, the clicks echoing in the silent room. The vault door creaked open like an old church door. After a few moments of searching, Mr. Alastair returned with a long leather-bound ledger and a thick, wax-sealed envelope. He laid them on the desk. "My grandfather was a very meticulous man," he said, his voice soft. "He handled Elias Blackwood's affairs personally. Your great-grandfather was, by all accounts, a visionary, and a man who did not trust easily." He carefully broke the seal on the envelope and unfolded the document within. It was the original trust deed. As Mr. Alastair read through the legal jargon, Liam's world began to shift on its axis. The revelation was more staggering than he could have ever imagined. His great-grandfather, Elias, had not leased the land in a conventional sense. He had placed it in an ironclad 99-year generational trust. The terms were explicit. The lease payments were to be collected and reinvested by the trust administrators, Alastair, Finch and Sons, for the benefit of his descendants. But the land itself could never be sold. And there were two critical clauses. The first stated that upon the expiration of the 99-year lease, which had occurred 3 months ago, all rights, titles, and ownership of the land, and any improvements thereupon, would revert unconditionally to the eldest living direct heir of the Blackwood family line. The second clause, the one that made Liam's breath catch in his throat, was a moral covenant. It stipulated that the land must ultimately be used for a purpose that provided a tangible benefit to the community, such as education, arts, or public service. A purely commercial enterprise like a luxury skyscraper was a direct violation of the spirit of the trust. Liam stared at the lawyer, his mind struggling to process the enormity of what he was hearing. "Improvements," he whispered. "Does that mean the building?" "Mr." Alastair gave a small, grim smile. "It means the building, Mr. Blackwood, the tower, the foundation, the steel, every pane of glass. According to this document, which has been legally binding for a century, Blackwood Tower belongs to you." The room fell silent, the only sound the frantic beating of Liam's own heart. He was no longer a server. He was no longer a victim. He was the owner of the single most valuable piece of real estate in the city. The very symbol of Evelyn and Marcus's power and his own humiliation was, in fact, his. Mr. Alastair explained the mechanism of their colossal error. Over the decades, as the lease was passed from one corporate entity to another, the original terms were lost in a sea of paperwork. Marcus's legal team, in their haste and arrogance, had likely performed a cursory title search, saw a long-standing lease, and assumed it was standard. They never bothered to dig back 100 years. They never bothered to read the fine print. They had built their billion-dollar empire on a foundation of sand, entirely and ironically dependent on the legacy of the man whose name they had plastered across their building as a branding choice. For a long moment, Liam was paralyzed by the shock, the sheer, beautiful absurdity of it all. He thought of Evelyn's smirk, of Marcus's condescending chuckle, of the $100 bill at his feet. He thought of the years of being made to feel small, worthless and invisible. A cold, hard clarity washed over him, extinguishing the last embers of his grief and replacing them with something else. It was the feeling of holding a royal flush in a game where his opponents thought he had already folded. He looked at Mr. Alastair, his gaze steady and clear for the first time in years. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming a history and a name that had been stolen and cheapened. It was about balance. "What do we do now?" Liam asked, his voice no longer trembling. Mr. Alastair slid a pen and a single piece of paper across the desk. It was a formal declaration asserting his rights as the sole beneficiary of the Elias Blackwood Trust. "Now," the lawyer said, his eyes twinkling, "you decide. You hold all the cards, Mr. Blackwood. It is time to play your hand." Liam picked up the pen. The weight of it felt substantial, real. It was the weight of his past and the key to his future. He thought of Evelyn one last time, not with anger, but with a strange, distant pity. She had wanted to be the queen of a grand empire. She had no idea she had built her castle on his land. With a firm, steady hand, he signed his name. The sleeping giant was awake. The strategy session that followed was not one of rage-fueled revenge, but of surgical precision. Liam and Mr. Alastair spent the next week holed up in the law firm's library, surrounded by legal texts and blueprints of the tower. Liam, with his archivist's mind, absorbed the complexities of property law and trust administration with unnerving speed. The plan they formulated was elegant in its cruelty, designed not just to reclaim his property, but to dismantle Marcus's entire world using his own arrogance as the primary weapon. "We will not contact them directly," Mr. Alastair advised, peering over his spectacles. A direct confrontation would give them time to hide assets, to spin the narrative. Men like Marcus Thorne don't respond to legal arguments. They respond to financial hemorrhaging. The nature of the plan was threefold. First, they would sever Marcus's financial lifelines. Second, they would create a public relations nightmare based on his company's gross negligence. Third, and most importantly, they would use the community benefit clause of the trust to seize the moral high ground, framing this not as a personal dispute, but as a righteous act to reclaim the city's soul from a predatory developer. To Marcus, but to the board of directors, to Marcus, but to the board of directors of the three major financial institutions that held the mortgages and lines of credit for Thorne Development, with the Blackwood Tower as the primary collateral. The letters were simple. They stated with accompanying irrefutable documentation that the collateral securing their multi-hundred-million-dollar loans, the land beneath Blackwood Tower, was not and had never been the property of Marcus Thorne. The trust was asserting its ownership, effective immediately. The letters concluded with a polite but firm notice that any further payments made from Thorne Development to the trust's dormant account would be rejected. The first domino was pushed. All Liam had to do now was wait and watch it fall. The first sign of the collapse came 2 days later. Marcus Thorne was in a board meeting boasting about projected Q4 profits when his assistant interrupted, her face pale. An urgent call from the CEO of Sterling National Bank. Marcus took the call with an air of annoyance, which quickly morphed into disbelief and then into puce-faced rage. He stormed back into the boardroom, shouting that it was a clerical error, a pathetic shakedown by some crackpot who had crawled out of the woodwork. He ordered his legal team to crush it immediately, but the fire was already spreading. By the end of the day, the other two banks had called. His primary lines of credit, the very lifeblood of his operation, were frozen. All of them, pending a full-scale investigation into the tower's title deed. Disbelief gave way to panic. Marcus's world was built on leverage and cash flow. Without the banks, he was paralyzed. He screamed at his lawyers who were scrambling, utterly blindsided. How could they have missed this? A century-old trust? It was impossible. But the documents faxed over by Mr. Alastair's office were undeniably authentic. Evelyn's reaction was one of pure, unadulterated fury, directed not at the situation, but at the inconvenience it was causing her. Their platinum card was declined while she was buying a $5,000 handbag. She called Marcus, screeching into the phone about the humiliation. "Fix it, Marcus. I don't care what it takes. Just fix it," she commanded, utterly oblivious to the scale of the cataclysm unfolding beneath them. The cascade effect began in earnest. The news inevitably leaked. A small financial blog ran the first story, which was then picked up by a major business journal. The headline was devastating. Thorne's Titan. Did a billion-dollar tower get built on rented land? Thorne Development stock, which had been soaring, nosedived. It lost 30% of its value in a single day. Contractors who hadn't been fully paid for their work on the tower began to panic and filed multi-million-dollar liens against the property. Investors, smelling blood in the water, started calling in their notes. The financial house of cards, built on Marcus's reputation and borrowed money, began to sway violently. Through it all, Liam watched from a distance. He took a temporary job as a barista in a small cafe across the plaza from the Blackwood Tower. Every morning, he would serve coffee to the stressed-out executives who worked in the building, listening to their hushed, worried conversations about the title dispute and the company's sudden instability. One afternoon, he saw Evelyn and Marcus stride into the plaza, their faces grim.
"4! They're frozen, Evelyn, all of 4! They're frozen, Evelyn, all of them!" Marcus shot back, his usual slick composure gone, replaced by a raw, desperate fear. "Some ancient family trust has laid claim to the land. We're trying to fight it, but what?" she demanded. "Their claim looks solid." Liam stood behind the counter, polishing a glass, his expression a perfect mask of polite indifference. He watched the architects of his ruin begin to turn on each other, their alliance dissolving under the first real pressure it had ever faced. The irony was so thick, so delicious, he could almost taste it in the air. He had never felt so powerful in his entire life. Their desperation culminated in a hastily organized investor confidence party held in the tower's now infamous Grand Ballroom. It was a pathetic attempt to project strength and control.
Liam, through a temp agency, managed to get hired as a server for the event. He wanted a front-row seat for the final act of their hubris. The party was a disaster. The ballroom that had been packed with the city's elite just weeks ago was now sparsely populated with a few nervous-looking junior partners and bottom-feeding journalists sniffing for a story. Evelyn, her smile stretched into a painful rictus, floated through the room, trying to pretend this was the triumph she had envisioned. Marcus gave a blustering, unconvincing speech about temporary market fluctuations and unfounded legal challenges. Liam moved through the room, a phantom in a black uniform, his tray held steady. He approached Evelyn and Marcus as they stood alone, their backs to the room. "Canapé?" he asked, his voice perfectly level. They turned, and for a second their masks dropped. He saw raw, undiluted panic in their eyes. Evelyn looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a server but a ghost from a past she had tried to bury. A flicker of suspicion, a desperate, impossible question, crossed her face, but she dismissed it. It was too absurd. He was nothing, a nobody. "No, thank you," she said, her voice brittle. "We're fine." Liam simply nodded and moved on, a faint smile playing on his lips. They weren't fine. They were drowning, and they had no idea that the man they had thrown overboard was the one holding the only life raft. The time for observation was over. The time for the final confrontation had arrived. The summons came on a crisp autumn morning. It was not a lawsuit, but an invitation. a meeting requested by the trustees of the Elias Blackwood Trust to discuss the orderly transition of the property at 1 Blackwood Plaza. It was to be held at the offices of Alistair, Finch and Sons. Marcus and Evelyn arrived like deposed monarchs, cloaked in a fragile shell of defiance. Marcus wore his most expensive suit, a piece of sartorial armour against the impending doom. Evelyn was dressed in funereal black, her face a mask of cold fury. They still believed this was a negotiation, a shakedown they could resolve by writing a large cheque. They walked into the conference room, expecting to face a panel of stuffy lawyers. Instead, they saw Liam. He was sitting at the head of the long, polished table, Mr. Alistair seated quietly at his side. He wasn't wearing a server's uniform or a barista's apron. He was dressed in a simple, well-fitting grey suit. He looked calm, centered, and utterly in control. The colour drained from their faces. Evelyn staggered back a step as if she had been physically struck. "You," she breathed, the word a mixture of pure shock and dawning horror. Marcus stared, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish out of water. Liam let the silence stretch, savouring. Their confusion. He gestured to the chairs opposite him. "Please, sit down. We have a lot to discuss." They sat, their movements stiff and robotic. The air in the room was thick with unspoken questions and suffocating dread. Liam looked from one to the other, his gaze as cold and hard as the marble floor of the gala. "I imagine you're both wondering what's going on," he began, his voice even and measured. He then launched into his monologue, the words he had been rehearsing in his mind for weeks. "You spent 10 years treating me like I was nothing. You dismissed my work, my life, my name. You treated me like a piece of furniture in the house you eventually took from me." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "You threw me away, convinced I was worthless. But what you didn't know, what you were too arrogant and self-obsessed to ever consider, was that the one thing you coveted most, the very foundation of your entire paper empire, was built on that same worthless name. My name." He laid it all out for them. The story of Elias Blackwood, the century-old trust, the 99-year lease, their catastrophic oversight. He explained every detail with the dispassionate precision of the archivist he was, presenting the facts of their ruin like a historical record. With each sentence, their facades crumbled further. Marcus finally found his voice. It was a strangled roar of denial. "This is insane! It's a trick! You can't... You're a nobody! I'll sue you into oblivion!" he bellowed, his face turning a blotchy red. Mr. Alistair cleared his throat softly. "I assure you, Mr. Thorne, our documentation is impeccable. We have already had it verified by 3 independent auditors. Your legal team's failure to conduct due diligence is, frankly, a textbook case of professional negligence. You have no claim?" "None." The finality in the old lawyer's voice broke something in Marcus. His rage collapsed into a pathetic, wheezing desperation. "What do you want?" he pleaded, his eyes now on Liam. "Money! How much? Name your price. I'll pay it." It was then that Evelyn's breakdown began. The shock had worn off, replaced by a volcanic eruption of fury and disbelief. "Pay him!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Don't you dare offer him a penny, Marcus! This is my life! He's trying to steal my life!" She turned her venomous gaze on Liam. "You pathetic worm! You did this? You planned this all along? You were always so jealous, so resentful of my success. You couldn't stand to see me happy, to see me with a real man." Her words, once so powerful, now had no effect on him. They were just noise, the desperate shrieks of a cornered animal. She tried a different tactic. her tone shifting to one of saccharine pleading. "Liam, please. Think of everything we shared. 10 years. You can't just destroy all of that. We had good times, didn't we? Remember?" Liam looked at her, his expression unmoved. "The only thing I remember, Evelyn, is you tossing $100 at my feet because you stained my shirt. You valued our entire history at less than the cost of your dry cleaning. So no, I don't think we'll be reminiscing." That was the final blow. Her mask of civility shattered into a million pieces. "I hate you!" she screamed, lunging to her feet, her hands clawing the air. "I wish I had never met you. You are nothing. You will always be nothing." Her tirade devolved into incoherent sobs, a public spectacle of a woman who had lost everything and knew it. Liam stood up, his movement calm and deliberate. He looked down at the two people who had tried to erase him. He felt no anger, no hatred. "Going to name my price, but it's not going to name my price, but it's not money." He looked around the opulent conference room, then seemed to look through the walls, up at the towering skyscraper that bore his name. "I'm not selling. I'm not negotiating. I am evicting you," he stated plainly. "The building is mine. The land is mine. And per the terms of the trust established by my great-grandfather, it will be used for the benefit of the community." He revealed the final act of his plan. "I'm converting the tower. The lower floors will become the Blackwood Center for urban history and architectural preservation. The upper floors will be converted into subsidized live work lofts for artists, academics, and historians, people who contribute to the soul of this city, not just its skyline." It was a fate worse than bankruptcy for them. Their monument to greed would become a haven for everything they despised: art, knowledge, and community. Their legacy would be erased and rewritten by him. He turned and walked toward the door, leaving them in the wreckage of their lives. He paused at the threshold and looked back one last time. "Mr. Alistair will be in touch with your lawyers regarding the timeline for vacating the premises," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "And Evelyn? You can keep the $100. He walked out without looking back, the sound of her renewed screaming fading behind him, leaving them to be dealt with by the law and the consequences of their own cruel choices. The aftermath was as swift as it was brutal. Marcus Thorne's empire imploded. Faced with insurmountable debt, no assets, and a litany of lawsuits from furious investors, Thorne Development filed for Chapter 7, bankruptcy. Marcus was personally ruined, his name becoming a cautionary tale in the business world, a synonym for hubris and catastrophic failure. He was last seen by a journalist getting into a ride-share, his face grey and defeated. Evelyn's downfall was even more precipitous. With Marcus's fortune gone, her high society friends abandoned her overnight. The invitations stopped coming, the calls went unanswered. She was a pariah, a painful reminder of how quickly fortunes could turn. She was forced to sell her designer clothes and jewelry just to pay rent on a small, drab apartment. The final crushing humiliation came when a gossip blog posted a photo of her working behind the counter of a luxury cosmetics store in a suburban mall, a service job. She was now on the other side of the transaction, forced to smile and cater to the whims of wealthy women, just like the person she used to be. Beatrice, having co-signed several of Marcus's loans in a fit of social climbing fervor, was forced to sell her lavish home and move into a small condominium, her life of leisure and judgment coming to an abrupt and ignominious end. Their ruin was total, a perfect reflection of the emptiness they had cultivated in their own souls. Liam, in contrast, did not embrace the life of a flashy billionaire. True to his word, he established the Blackwood Center. The transformation of the tower was his new project, his life's work. He oversaw every detail, ensuring the building that was once a symbol of exclusion became a beacon of culture and learning. He used the immense wealth generated by the Trust's century of investments to create grants for struggling historians and scholarships for underprivileged students. He lived modestly in a comfortable apartment not far from the center. His life was quiet, but it was full. He found purpose not in accumulation, but in contribution. After the takeover, he was giving a tour of the center's main gallery to a group of university students. He spoke with passion about the city's history, his voice resonating with a confidence he had never possessed before. At the back of the group was a woman with intelligent, curious eyes. She was the new curator for the city museum. Her name was Clara. She stayed behind after the tour, asking him insightful questions about archival methods. They talked for over an hour, a connection forming instantly, built on a shared respect for the past and a gentle, unassuming kindness. They started having coffee, then dinner. For the first time, Liam found himself in a relationship with an equal, a partner who valued his mind and his character, not his net worth. She loved him for the quiet, passionate man he had always been. One evening, standing with Clara on the observation deck of the Blackwood Centre, looking out at the glittering expanse of the city, Liam felt a profound sense of peace. The tower no longer felt like a symbol of revenge, it was a symbol of restoration. He had not only reclaimed his name and his future, but he had also restored a piece of the city's integrity, fulfilling a promise made over a century ago. The ultimate victory wasn't the downfall of his enemies, it was the life he had built in the aftermath. He had learned that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or square footage, but in purpose, integrity, and the quiet strength to endure. True power lay not in what we display for the world to see, but in the foundations we build, the history we honor, and the legacy we choose to leave behind. He had been through the fire and emerged not just intact, but forged into something stronger. He was Liam Blackwood, and he was finally home.